My mom's only wish was a home, the toddler whispered. The billionaire broke down. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and the marble floor of the Whitfield estate still smelled faintly of wet umbrellas and expensive candles. Nathaniel Cole stood by the window of his study, phone pressed to his ear, half listening to a merger call that had already dragged on for 40 minutes. He was 38 years old, and lately every conversation sounded the same to him. Numbers, projections, empty congratulations. He almost didn't notice the small shadow standing in the doorway. Lily was 3 years old, wrapped in a faded gray sweater 2 sizes too big. Her dark curls pulled back with a rubber band instead of a proper hair tie. She was the daughter of Marta, the newest housemaid, hired only 6 weeks earlier after the previous staff agency sent 3 candidates who quit within days of meeting Nathaniel's exacting housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle. Lily wasn't supposed to be upstairs. Children of staff were kept strictly in the East Wing per house policy, a policy Nathaniel himself had signed off on without much thought, the way he signed off on most things that didn't involve a decimal point. But there she was, standing at his study door, holding a folded piece of paper in both hands like it was something sacred. "Sir," she said, so quietly he almost missed it over the call. He lowered the phone. "Sir. My mom's only wish was a home." Nathaniel blinked. He ended the call without excusing himself, something he never did. "What did you say?" Lily held out the paper. It was a child's drawing, a small square house with a triangle roof, 2 stick figures holding hands in front of it, and a sun with too many rays scratched into the corner. Underneath, in handwriting that clearly wasn't a 3-year-old's, someone had written, "Someday. For Lily." "Mama draws it for me," Lily said. "Every night. She says someday." Nathaniel crouched down slowly, the way he might approach something fragile and unfamiliar. He had built 3 companies, sat across from senators, negotiated deals worth more than some countries' budgets, and yet he found himself completely unequipped for the small, steady voice of a child holding out a folded drawing. "Where is your mother right now?" Lily pointed toward the staff stairwell. "She's crying. In the laundry room. She thinks I don't hear." Something in Nathaniel's chest tightened in a way boardroom losses never managed to do. He followed her down the narrow servants' staircase, past the industrial dryers, into the small laundry annex where Marta sat on an overturned basket, a phone clutched in her hand, her shoulders shaking silently. She hadn't heard him enter. On the small folding table beside her sat an eviction notice. 30 days, final, no extensions, and a stack of unopened bills rubber-banded together. When she looked up and saw Nathaniel standing there, her face went pale with something between embarrassment and fear. "Mr. Cole, I'm so sorry, sir. Lily wasn't supposed to." "Don't apologize." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "How long has this been going on?" Marta's eyes darted to the notice on the table, then to her daughter, who had wrapped both arms around her mother's leg. "It's not your concern, sir. I'll handle it. I always do." But Nathaniel had already picked up the eviction letter. The building was on the east side of the city, the kind of place he'd driven past 1,000 times without registering it existed. The amount owed wasn't large. Not by his standards. It was, in fact, an amount so small compared to what he spent on watches he never wore that the smallness of it made him feel something close to shame. "You've worked here 6 weeks, he said slowly, "and you never once mentioned this. You don't hire someone to also carry their problems, sir." Marta wiped her face quickly, straightening her posture the way people do when they've spent years being told not to take up space. "I'm not asking for anything." Lily looked up at Nathaniel with the unguarded directness only small children possess. "Mama says a home is when nobody can make you leave." Nathaniel folded the drawing carefully, the way one might fold something worth more than it appeared. "Nobody's going to make you leave," he said. He didn't fully understand yet why he said it, or what it would cost him, or who would come out of the shadows to oppose it. He only knew that something in the quiet certainty of a 3-year-old's whispered wish had cracked something open in him that had been sealed for a long time. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the eviction notice on the table wasn't an ordinary one. And the name quietly stamped in small print at the bottom of the letterhead was a name Nathaniel would recognize the moment he looked closely enough. He didn't look closely enough. Not yet. By the next morning, Nathaniel had already instructed his assistant, Priya, to look into the situation quietly. Pay off the debt, secure the apartment, keep it simple, keep it private. He did not want gratitude. He did not want headlines. He wanted, for reasons he hadn't fully examined, to fix something that felt fixable in a life otherwise full of problems too large for one man to solve alone. Priya returned within the hour. Her expression unusually careful. "There's a complication," she said, setting a folder on his desk. "The eviction notice. It wasn't filed by the landlord." Nathaniel frowned. "Then who?" "The building was quietly purchased 8 months ago by a shell company. Faircrest Holdings. I traced the ownership through 2 layers before it dead-ended at a private trust." Priya hesitated. "The trust is managed by Claire Ashford." The name landed heavier than Nathaniel expected. Claire was his fiancée. 3 months from a wedding that half the city's society pages had already covered in detail. Claire, who had grown up in a house not unlike his own, who spoke fluently in the language of galas and foundations and photographed generosity. "That can't be right," Nathaniel said. "Claire runs a housing charity. She wouldn't evict families. She builds homes." "I only know what the filings say, sir." Nathaniel told himself there had to be an explanation. Perhaps Claire didn't personally oversee every property in the trust. Perhaps it was a mistake, an oversight buried under layers of paperwork she'd never seen. He wanted badly for that to be true. That evening, he brought it up carefully over dinner, watching her reaction the way he might watch a negotiating partner across a table. "Faircrest," Claire repeated, swirling her wine with practiced calm. "That's one of dozens of small residential holdings under the foundation. I don't personally manage evictions, Nathaniel. That's handled by property management. A woman who works in my house is about to lose her home. Her daughter drew me a picture of it." Something flickered behind Claire's eyes, gone so fast he nearly convinced himself he'd imagined it. "That's tragic," she said smoothly. "I'll have someone look into it personally. I promise." It should have been reassuring. Instead, it left a residue of unease he couldn't name. Downstairs, Marta was folding laundry with the particular stillness of someone trying not to be noticed. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, arranging a handful of buttons into the shape of a house. "He's going to help us," Lily announced to no one in particular, moving a button into place like a chimney. "The houseman said." Marta smiled faintly but didn't answer. She had learned, in ways her daughter hadn't yet, that promises from powerful men rarely survived contact with reality. 2 days later, Priya returned to Nathaniel's office with new information, and this time her voice carried none of its usual composure. "The payoff went through," she said. "The debt is cleared. But this morning the building received a new notice. Structural safety violation. The entire property is being condemned for renovation, effective in 14 days. Every tenant has to leave. No exceptions." Nathaniel felt the floor of his understanding shift slightly. Convenient timing. "There's more." Priya placed a second document on the desk, a permit application for a full building conversion. Luxury condominiums. Projected completion in 18 months. Filed under Faircrest Holdings. "Someone doesn't want that family staying in that building," Priya said quietly. "Debt or no debt." Nathaniel stared at the permit, at Claire's foundation letterhead stamped discreetly in the corner, and felt the first genuine crack in something he had spent months building carefully around his own heart. That night, unable to sleep, he wandered down toward the kitchen for water and found Lily sitting alone on the staircase in her pajamas, hugging her knees. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Mama thinks the bad lady is going to take the house again." Nathaniel crouched beside her. "What bad lady, sweetheart?" Lily hesitated, the way children do when repeating something they overheard and weren't meant to understand. "The lady who came before. The one with the shiny ring." Mama says she came to our old building once. Before we worked here. Nathaniel's chest went cold. Lily, he said carefully. What did this lady look like? But Lily had already moved on, distracted by a moth circling the hallway light, the way children's attention drifts without warning. Nathaniel remained crouched on the staircase long after she'd gone back to bed, staring at nothing, turning over a single sentence that refused to leave him alone. The lady with the shiny ring. Claire wore a very particular engagement ring. One he had chosen himself 11 months earlier. From a small velvet box he still remembered the weight of in his palm. Nathaniel didn't confront Claire immediately. Instead he did what he did best. He investigated quietly, the way he would any acquisition that felt too convenient to be honest. He asked Priya to trace the history of the Faircrest properties back further, past the 8-month ownership window, into the years before. What she found didn't just complicate the story. It rewrote it entirely. Marta's family had lived in that same building once before. 5 years earlier under a different landlord, in a different unit, back when Marta was still married and Lily wasn't yet born. Records showed a violent, sudden eviction during that time too, executed under circumstances the tenant board had flagged as suspicious but never formally investigated. The landlord at the time had been a private buyer operating under an LLC that, when Priya finally cracked its layered ownership, connected, impossibly undeniably, to Claire's family trust, years before Claire had ever met Nathaniel. She's targeted this family before, Priya said carefully. Or somebody connected to her has. Nathaniel sat with that for a long moment. Why would anyone target a housekeeper and her family, twice 5 years apart? It was Marta, when Nathaniel finally sat her down and asked her directly, who filled in the piece none of the documents could explain. My husband, she said quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap, worked for a woman years ago, before Lily was born. He was a driver and later a bookkeeper for her family's private accounts. Marta's voice thinned. He found something in the numbers he wasn't supposed to find. Money moved in ways that weren't legal. He tried to report it. 2 weeks later he lost his job, and our apartment was suddenly sold out from under us. We had 30 days to leave, just like now. Where is your husband now? Nathaniel asked gently. Marta's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. He died in a car accident 4 months after we lost that apartment. The police called it an accident. I've never fully believed that. Nathaniel felt something settle into place with the cold click of a lock turning. The woman he worked for, he said slowly. Was it Claire's mother? Marta nodded once. The Ashford family. The room seemed to tilt slightly around him. Claire hadn't simply inherited a trust with a messy old property in it. She had inherited, and apparently continued, a pattern. A family playbook of quiet, deniable cruelty toward anyone who threatened their carefully polished image. And now, without knowing it, that pattern had walked directly into Nathaniel's own house, wearing a rubber band in her hair and drawing pictures of a home she was terrified to lose twice in one lifetime. He confronted Claire that night, laying the documents across the dining table between them like evidence in a trial neither of them had agreed to attend. For a moment, her composure didn't break. Then slowly it did. Not into tears, but into something colder and more honest than he'd ever seen from her. You don't understand what it's like, she said quietly, to inherit a family's mistakes and spend your entire life trying to bury them so deep no one ever finds the shovel. So your solution was to bury a family instead. Twice. I didn't know it was the same family until this week, Claire said, and for the first time, Nathaniel believed her. My mother handled it back then. I only found out when the renovation permit crossed my desk and I recognized the address. And you filed the condemnation anyway. Claire's jaw tightened. If that story comes out, if anyone connects my family to what happened to that man, it destroys everything my mother built. Everything I inherited. I panicked, Nathaniel. I made a choice to protect what's mine. A child's home, Nathaniel said quietly, isn't a threat to protect yourself from. Claire didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything her practiced composure had spent years hiding. Nathaniel walked out of the dining room that night, no longer certain whether he was more furious at Claire, or at himself, for 3 months of not truly looking closely enough at the woman he had planned to marry. The condemnation notice remained legally active despite everything Nathaniel now knew. And legal knowledge without legal power meant nothing against a 14-day countdown. Claire's lawyers, when contacted, insisted the permit process was already too far along to reverse without triggering exactly the kind of public scrutiny Claire had spent her whole life avoiding. Scrutiny that would now also expose Nathaniel's own name, tangled up in the mess through his engagement. "If you fight this publicly," Claire warned him during their final conversation, her voice flat and businesslike now, stripped of any remaining warmth, "you don't just destroy my family's name. You destroy yours too. Everyone will ask what kind of man almost married into this. You'll be a headline before you're a hero." Nathaniel understood the threat clearly enough. In the world he operated in, reputations were currency, and Claire was offering to devalue his without hesitation. "Then let them ask," he said. He met with his own legal team the next morning and made a decision that surprised even himself. Not a quiet payoff, not a private fix hidden safely behind closed doors, but a public one. He instructed his foundation, the one that bore his late father's name and had spent years funding scholarships nobody photographed, to purchase the entire building outright from Faircrest Holdings at market value, converting it immediately into permanently protected, tenant-owned housing. No renovations. No condominiums. No 14-day countdowns ever again for anyone who lived there. The purchase required Claire's trust to sign off on the sale. She had 2 choices: accept a clean, quiet transaction that made the entire embarrassing history disappear from her family's ledger, or refuse and force a public legal battle that would drag both families' names, and the story of Marta's husband, into full daylight. Claire chose the quiet option. Course she did. But quiet did not mean the danger disappeared entirely. 2 nights before the paperwork finalized, Marta received a phone call from an unknown number. A voice, calm and unhurried, suggesting she might want to reconsider stirring up old history for her daughter's sake. Marta didn't sleep that night. She sat by Lily's bed until sunrise, the way she had once sat by a hospital bed years earlier, waiting for news that never came the way she'd hoped. When she told Nathaniel the next morning, his expression hardened into something Priya had rarely seen in 3 years of working for him. "Get security on Marta and Lily immediately," he said. "And pull every file connected to Ashford family associates from the last decade. If someone made that call, I want to know who signs their paycheck." The trail, when Priya finished tracing it 2 days later, led not to Claire directly, but to her mother's longtime attorney, a man who had handled the original cover-up 5 years earlier and clearly had no intention of letting old evidence resurface now that his own name was buried somewhere in those same records. Confronted with Priya's findings and the quiet threat of a criminal referral, the attorney folded quickly, providing a written statement confirming what had happened to Marta's husband years earlier: the falsified reports, the sudden eviction, the deliberately obscured payout designed to look like a settlement rather than what it actually was: hush money. It wasn't the dramatic courtroom reckoning Nathaniel might once have imagined for a moment like this. It was quieter: a folder of documents, a signed statement, a truth finally written down in ink instead of buried in silence. But for Marta, sitting across the table as Nathaniel read the attorney's statement aloud to her for the first time, it was everything. She didn't cry the way Nathaniel expected. She simply closed her eyes, breathed once, deeply, and whispered. He wasn't imagining it. He was right. Lily, playing quietly nearby with a set of new crayons Nathaniel had bought her without quite admitting to himself why, looked up at exactly that moment. "Mama," she said, "why are you smiling and crying at the same time?" Marta pulled her daughter into her lap. "Because sometimes, baby, both things can be true." The public fallout, when it came, arrived exactly the way Claire had feared and exactly the way Nathaniel had accepted it might. A local investigative reporter, tipped off through channels Nathaniel never fully explained even to Priya, published the full story. The original eviction, the falsified reports, the quiet payout disguised as compensation, and the attempted second eviction 5 years later that had nearly repeated history entirely. Claire's family foundation, once celebrated in society pages for its housing initiatives, was forced into a public reckoning it could not smooth over with a well-worded statement. The engagement, unsurprisingly, ended within the week, not with a dramatic scene, but with a short, cold exchange of lawyers finalizing what both of them already understood was over. Nathaniel expected relief. What he felt instead was something quieter and steadier, the sense of having narrowly avoided building a life on ground that had never truly been solid. The building itself reopened 3 weeks later under its new status, fully renovated not into luxury condominiums but into safe, permanently protected housing for the families who already lived there. Nathaniel attended the small reopening ceremony without cameras, without a prepared speech, standing quietly near the back while a city council member cut a modest ribbon across the newly repaired front doors. Marta stood near the front with Lily on her hip, wearing a coat that actually fit her for the first time in months. When the small crowd began to disperse, she made her way over to Nathaniel, Lily reaching for him instinctively the way small children do with people they've decided, without much explanation, to trust completely. "I never asked you for any of this," Marta said quietly. "I know," Nathaniel said. "That's exactly why I did it." Lily tugged at his sleeve, holding up a new drawing, the same small house with the triangle roof, the same 2 stick figures holding hands. But this time, there was a third figure standing slightly apart from the others, holding a briefcase instead of nothing at all. "Who's that one?" Nathaniel asked, crouching down the way he had that very first evening in his study. "That's the house man," Lily said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He helped us find our someday." Nathaniel folded the drawing carefully, the same careful way he had folded the very first one, and slipped it into his jacket pocket, where it stayed long after the ink had begun to fade. In the months that followed, Nathaniel quietly restructured a portion of his father's foundation to focus specifically on housing security for working families. No press releases, no galas, just steady, unglamorous work that rarely made headlines but changed lives in ways headlines never could. Marta remained with the household, not out of obligation, but because for the first time in years, she had somewhere she genuinely wanted to be. Lily grew as children do, quickly and without ceremony. But even years later, whenever anyone asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up, she would answer without hesitation. Someone who helps people find their someday. And somewhere in a drawer in Nathaniel Cole's study, tucked carefully between old contracts and quarterly reports that meant considerably less to him now than they once had, sat a small folded drawing of a house. Proof, if he ever needed reminding, that the most important deal he'd ever made had cost him nothing but attention, and had given him, in return, something no merger ever could.